Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jessica Rockhold, and I'm the Executive Director of the Midwest Center for Holocaust Education. It's my pleasure to welcome you here today for what is our third presentation in our series, Bringing Europe Home. If you're just joining us for the first time today, this is a series that looks at the locations our European travelers experienced in our 2023 trip. And our intention is to do two things for you today. One is to give you some of the history and context that we provided to our learners before we traveled to Europe, and then to show you some of what they experienced on the ground there and to show you what these locations look like today. If you were with us last week, we were looking at the experience of the Jewish community in Prague and the situation in the Terezin ghetto. And today we're going to stay in the Czech Republic. One of the features of our program to Europe last year was that while we were looking at the Holocaust and the Jewish experience in these spaces, we were also considering the occupation of those territories and what that meant to the locals in that space, both Jewish and non-Jewish. And so today, Dr. Shelley Klein, who is MCHE's historian and director of education, is going to take us through the Czech experience of occupation, looking at the Czech Resistance and the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich. So it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Shelley Klein.
Thank you, Jessica. As she mentioned, we are looking at sort of this civilian experience here in the Czech Republic today. And I think that's something that I want us to think about throughout, and we'll come back to that at the end as well, keeping in mind just in general the civilian toll that this conflict took. Right. So the picture you're looking at now, we'll come back to this. This is a memorial that was put in place on the site of the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich there in Prague. And it is specifically dedicated to the parachutists who enacted this assassination, but more broadly, it's meant to honor the resistance of everyone involved in that assassination and in broader Czech resistance during the war. If you were with us last time, this will sound a little familiar, but if not, just to kind of get us up to speed, we're thinking about where we're featuring today. Czechoslovakia was a country that came into existence at the end of World War I. As I mentioned when we were talking about like our highlights of Prague, one of the highlights for me last time was being in a cafe that was attached to the opera house where the state of Czechoslovakia was actually declared in the post-war period, which was just sort of a good reminder of how young this country was. And as we see here, this is a country that had a very brief interwar existence. Czechoslovakia, Hitler first sets its sights on Czechoslovakia and the Sudetenland when he kind of alleges that there are the German-speaking portion of the population of Czechoslovakia living primarily, but not exclusively, in these border regions were being mistreated by the Czech government. They were not, but on that pretense, Hitler goes to the League of Nations and world leaders and says that he demands that this section of Czechoslovakia be given to Germany. If the world wants to avoid war, he wants this section of Czechoslovakia. And in fact, he is granted it. World leaders meet in Munich. As I mentioned in our Munich session, Neville Chamberlain, the leader of Great Britain, actually stays in Hitler's private apartment during this conference. And of course, we know the outcome. And that is this section is given away to Germany. That happens in September, but then throughout the fall, Germany is making plans for a further invasion to take over the rest of Czechoslovakia. And that's exactly what we see happen in March of 1939. So here you can see Nazi troops are marching down the streets and a little bit of a view of what that looks like today. Once they have invaded Czechoslovakia, they will Slovakia declares its independence right before that, so it becomes kind of a puppet state of Germany. There are portions of Slovakia that are given to Hungary, another ally of Nazi Germany. There's even some sections that are given to Poland in this kind of partitioning and occupation of Czechoslovakia. So that means the lands of Bohemia and Moravia, those will be incorporated into the German Reich, this rump of Czechoslovakia as it is referred to. And that's where we'll see occupation really take place. And of course, once this happens, Britain and France do not intervene. This is very clearly against the Treaty of Versailles. As we know, war will not come until September, when Germany will invade Poland. But as we can see, Germany is on the move and clearly invading lands without the world responding. This is something that's the Sudetenland being given away to Germany. This invasion without Western response are two things that certainly stuck in the minds of people in this area then and now. Those of you who were with us in Europe during this experience might remember how frequently the Munich Agreement was mentioned, even today, because it really stuck out of these two moments where the West abandoned them. So here again, just a few shots of Prague, Old Town Square, what it looked like once the Nazis arrived. Again, many of you have been there. Very popular tourist destination. This is that exact same spot and what it looks like now. Similar, these are the Wehrmacht marching past the astrological clock. Again, if you've been to Prague, I'm sure you have a picture of it. There it is. And that's one of the things that I think is so powerful about being in these spaces, especially if you are familiar with the history behind it, kind of meshing together these layers, right? The one that we know from the photographs, and then being in that space and kind of toggling back and forth in your mind. Many of us think about the Czech Republic or in its post-Soviet phase, or Czechoslovakia during the Cold War, and we think of it as being kind of lumped in this kind of like Eastern mindset, right? We forget that in this particular interwar moment, Czechoslovakia was very Western-facing, had a lot of prominent industry. Their armament industry was especially noteworthy, and it's something that the Nazis were very interested in taking over. Skoda works, which were produced a lot of cars, still produce cars today. During the war, they were producing tanks. So Czech industry is something that the Germans really wanted to co-opt during their occupation. So we think about Czech resistance, obviously, as Jessica mentioned, and as the title of today's session indicates, the most well-known incident of Czech resistance is the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich. However, even before that, in the early days of occupation, the Czech population will participate in different forms of resistance. They'll boycott public transportation if Germans are on them. There are some large-scale demonstrations. The photo you see here is actually from the initial invasion when the troops arrive in Prague in March. And here you see a large group of citizens protesting the arrival of the troops. They have their fists up. It isn't in support, but rather in protest of the Nazi occupation. Later, there will be more significant armed uprisings or sabotage, things like that, which is one of the reasons that Reinhard Heydrich will be brought into power there. And then finally, at the end, we'll talk about the Prague uprising of May of 1945. So Reinhard Heydrich becomes the protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. He will sort of administer the territory out of the Prague castle. You can see it there in view. He is brought to Prague partially because of the active Czech resistance and the need to quell some of that. His predecessor was seen to be too soft on the Czech people, and so Heydrich is brought in to have a much firmer hand and to stop some of the sabotage and whatnot. Who is Reinhard Heydrich? Most of you, so if you've been with us in our Holocaust context, I think you probably know him in terms of his relationship to the Holocaust. That's what he is mostly known for when we talk about him. He's a relatively young man. He's 38 at the time of his assassination. So if you look at sort of his list of his resume here and what he's different agencies that he's been the head of, he was key in developing the Sister Heistdienst. He takes control of the Gestapo while he's still the head of the SD. Eventually, in 39, Göring will hand off developing plans for the Jewish solution in Germany. And then finally, in July 31st in 1941, he will be charged with the research and development phase of the Holocaust. So keep in mind, while we're talking about him in the context of governing Bohemian Moravia, he's also head of the Gestapo, head of the SD, and actively working on a final solution for the Jewish question in Europe. So very, very busy. It's in September. So again, if you look back at this timeline here, we can see in September is when he is appointed the protectorate of Bohemian Moravia. And he's there to enforce the Nazi policy and to make sure the Czech industry is really doing its best for the war effort. Very quickly, upon his arrival, he will begin terrorizing the Czech population. He'll declare martial law. Immediately, there are leaders, resistance leaders that are executed. And not only are they executed, but their names and their photos are distributed publicly so people understand like there was, this part of a public terror campaign, right, to send a warning message that this is what will happen if you resist. If you look at the numbers there, you can see thousands of people are arrested, hundreds are executed. And he also will enact policies to pretty much make expression of Czech culture and language very difficult, especially publicly. And because of his policies, the government we'll get to that in a second. In the midst of this choice, I want to say he will then convene the Wannsee Conference in January of 42, which will officially ratify the final solution. So again, lots on his plate. When we think about what's happening in these Czech lands, the long-term goal of this area was to be Germanized. There were some German-speaking people living there. They had different, perhaps treated a bit differently, but the Czech workforce in general is exploited. They can be conscripted. As we know, we'll see this becomes the policy once they move into other territories as well. But conscription of the local workforce is always something that the Nazis do, whether it be the work there in that particular location or conscripting people to be taken back into Germany or elsewhere in the Reich for work as well. So we do see a lot of movement of peoples during this time from the Nazi government. He does, again, lots of this is a policy of terror and kind of cracking down on not just resistance, but also making workers, increases the workday from 8 hours to 12 hours. At the same time, there is a small attempt to, pass out free shoes to some people or do some free time activities that only last a little while. So he does, well, it's mostly a very stick approach. There are moments where there are some carrots that are offered to the Czech people. Obviously, they were not fooled by the few nice things that were done. And by October, so September he's there, by October, the Czech military intelligence in London, so the government in exile, has already made the decision that they want to attempt to kill him. So with that, we will see British Special Operations begin training some of these members of Czechs in exile to go back into Prague to carry out this execution. So here are two of the men who were selected and who will in fact carry that out. So they parachute into back into Czech lands, and then it's May that he takes this. So Heydrich works in Prague, right? He's set up in the castle, and we see this we'll talk about this next time when we talk about Krakow. Nazi administration likes to set up in like the traditional seats of power in these cities. We'll see that in Krakow. We see that here in Prague. They set up shop in the castle Prague. Very symbolic, right? Like this is the seat of power. So that's where he's operating out of. His wife doesn't want to live in Prague and live in the castle. So instead, they live outside in a fancy villa outside in the suburbs of Prague. So every day he drives to work, takes the same route to work in his open air Mercedes. He had recently just ignored sort of a notification that he was supposed to get his car reinforced because they were concerned about his security. So he ignores that, continues to drive in, same way every day. And it's at this particular curve here that it's a sharp curve in the road, as you can see. And, you know, the assassins have watched him, right? They've planned this. He's taken the same route every day, easy to follow his movements. And they feel like this is the best spot for an assassination because the car does, in fact, have to slow to take this pretty steep curve. There's also some trams, some streetcars that are running here at the same time. So as the car slows to take that turn, they jump out. One of them attempts to shoot him, but his gun jams. So the other one throws a bomb at the car. They're kind of briefly thrown off because the streetcar gets in the way for a minute, but they manage to attempt to shoot and throw the bomb. You can see here is what the site of that looks like today. The road has changed somewhat. So this is in the post-war period, the road moves a bit, but you can still see, even though it does move, the curve is still pretty sharp. And there again is that monument that we opened with, and you can see that just sort of there in the middle of the intersection to mark, or in the road to mark that site. So the explosion damages the car. You can see it blows up the back portion there. The assassins, like Heydrich, jumps up, you know, once the gun doesn't fire. They think that there's one, so they halt the car rather than driving off. They decide that the bodyguard and Heydrich are going to go after these guys. Then the bomb explosion hits him. They continue to return fire, but both assassins manage to get away. They think that they failed because Heydrich is up and running around and shooting at them, so they assume they've gone to all this effort and risk, and they've actually failed. One sort of brief interesting fact about this car is you can see two views of it here. This car eventually made its way at the end of the war to Denmark, where it's like after the assassination and other Nazis take it, it winds up in Denmark, and there it remains in a barn that collapses on it until the 1980s. And then a Mercedes collector buys it and starts to research the car, looks up its serial numbers, various markings on it, looks at the damage that's been done and repaired, and comes to the conclusion that this is in fact the car that Reinhard Heydrich was in at the time of his assassination, and now it is in the museum. There's another car in a Czech museum that alleges to be that car, but experts have connected that to the former commandant of Theresienstadt instead. Heydrich will die as a result of his injuries, but not immediately. So he's wounded, he's taken to the hospital. However, they don't want Czech doctors to treat him, so they delay his immediate treatment until a German doctor can be found. He will eventually get septicemia, and after 7 days, will eventually die on June 4th. Hitler, though, of course, extols him as a hero, privately was quite upset that Heydrich had exposed himself to the amount of risk that he had, and basically said that was really dumb and arrogant of him to go around in this open top car the way he had, especially when he was so important and irreplaceable. So certainly some frustration at the top level about that. So this is a brief video, show you a little bit of it, of the funeral of Heydrich. He has a portion of the funeral is done in Prague, and then they will transfer him to Berlin for yet another ceremony. He's interned in a cemetery there, but today, once the Red Army came in at the end of the war, they removed any markers of his grave, and so today his grave remains unmarked, and there's, you know, kind of a debate about where exactly it is, but they were, everyone was pretty adamant in the post-war period to not mark his grave, so it couldn't be a site where people came, neo-Nazis came to visit it.
Why choose Olathe Health for your annual mammogram? How about
There's the old square of Prague. Now I believe we're in Berlin at the Rice Chancellery. Oh no, we haven't switched yet. So you can see with the type of funeral this was, it gives you a sense, if you didn't get it already from the many things he's in charge of, how important he was in the Third Reich. Like this was a very important high level Nazi official. And so for him to be assassinated was, well, hugely embarrassing. But also you can tell from that funeral that they're going to, it's a massive state funeral. So not surprisingly, there will be some pretty serious reprisals that take place in the wake of his death. So Hitler favors killing large numbers of Czechs. He's kind of talked down because, again, Czech industry is very important to the war effort, and so they didn't want that to hurt the war effort in general. So they kind of scale it back. Still, the numbers are quite huge. One village to be dramatically impacted is the village of Lidice. Outside of Prague. And this was a village that was falsely linked to the assassination. Basically, there was a vague letter that was written between two people and discovered by the factory employer of one of them. And that was turned over to the Nazis, and based on this very thin evidence, which actually the letter had nothing to do with the assassination. I believe, if I remember correctly, it might have been even like a personal affair that was taking place. It wasn't even political. It was really just a matter between two people. Because of that, this town of Lidice will be targeted. So on June 10th, the Germans come into this town. They will kill the men, everyone over 14, all the men over 14. They will shoot there on site. The women are taken to Ravensbrück. The children, most of them will end up being taken to Lodz and gassed at Helmno. Some of them are taken to group homes run by the German state, where they will be like Germanized, Aryanized, and given to German families to raise as German. But you can see some of the scenes here from this destroyed village. I'm just going to play a little bit of the Nazis filmed the destruction of this village, so we'll play a little bit of that.
Lidice.
You can see now, so they've burned it, and then they will also begin like actually plowing it under to tear it down completely. I think what's noticeable when you watch this is, one, not just the destruction, but the great amount of time and labor it took them to complete this destruction. It wasn't just enough to kill the people, it wasn't just enough to burn the village, but they really wanted to tear it down, remove the stones, and make sure that no trace was left. So a big part of this is, you know, how very symbolic of a destruction it was, in terms of like the message it's sending. Like, this is what will happen if you kill Nazis. Your village will really be removed from the face of the earth. So this is kind of what it, like the map of the village, the overview of what it looks like. You can see at the top there, it says Nulidice. So after the war, there are survivors, women who were sent to Ravensbrück, children who were sent away. They come back and they will build Nulidice next to it. So they very purposely choose to not build on the site, but next to it, so that the site itself can remain a memorial to what was lost. And we see this happen. There's another village in France where a similar thing happens. And they do the same thing there. They rebuild the village, but next to it. So there's always this profound memorial of and void of what has been lost. This is what the space looks like today. So this is what we encountered when we drove there. It's a short drive from Prague. I think it took about, less than an hour to get there. And you can see it really is bare. The photo on the top is kind of an overview. The one in the bottom left corner, this is the first house that the Nazis came to and where they started the destruction process. And then the larger photo here, this is the site where most of the men were shot. So this is the estate where the men of the village were killed. And then you can see this is the remains of the church. This is a really old village. As many villages in Europe are, this village dates back to the 14th century. And the church that was destroyed was originally founded in the 1300s. It had, as European history goes, it suffered some damage over the centuries. But this is a place that had been in existence since the 14th century. And this is all that remains of the church. You can see there's a part of a crucifix that was found. That's now in the museum portion, and those are the metal doors that didn't fully burn, and those are in the museum as well. Other artifacts, this is the town, this is a sign from the town hall. A few personal items that were recovered after the war, some cups and just small metal artifacts that didn't burn, and then a shirt, a child's dress that was recovered. So I want to play for you a few snippets of testimony from mostly children who experienced this. They'll tell you what the town was like before, and then what happened to them, what they remember, their experience being Germanized, and then what that kind of return process process of returning home looked like.
V Lidicích, aby se řeklo, bylo všechno. Když se to veme, co tam veme? Byla to vesnice, vidíte, ale bylo tam hnedle všechno. Byl tam řezník, byl tam kovář a 3 hospody tam byly. Byla tam škola, byl tam kostel krásný, fara. A co jen jinýho tam bylo? Bylo tam hodně hezkých dětí.
No tak v té době, když se to stalo v těch Lidicích, tak mě bylo necelých 4 roky, 3,75 roku přesně.
Bylo mi 10 mi docházelo asi za 2 měsíce. Já si pamatuju, že maminka měla letní šaty, že jí všecko padalo z rukou. No, navlíkla na mě prostě prádlo, šaty, byla jsem na boso, měla jsem takový letní boty a kabátek. To si tak pamatuju.
Z 9. na 10. června 1942 k nám přišlo gestapo, byl to civil s nima, který mluvil česky, ten to překládal. No a nařídil, aby jsme se teple oblékli, vzali si něco k jídlu a že musíme jít do místní školy.
U dvírek jsem se loučila s tátou. A mně to jako bylo divný, že on se se mnou, já nevím, on snad něco tušil. A on mi říká, snadá Bůh, že se ještě uvidíme. Já jsem si říkal, bože můj, teď na 2 dny jdem do školy, co to vykládá. A ještě jeho slova byly, nezapomínej na Boha.
No a hnali nás do naší školy. No a v chodbě stálo gestapo taky zase a tam byla bedna a do té bedny to, co jsme měli zlatýho u sebe, všechno jsme tam museli teda hodit.
Když jsme tam byli všichni zkontrolováni podle policejních přihlášek ženy, tak jsme nákladní auta naložili, no a odvezli nás na Kladno.
Na ten pohled jsem nezapomněla nikdy a i vlák, když se mi zdálo o Lidicích, tak se mi zdálo o těch Lidicích, kterýma jsme projížděli. To mi to tak utkvělo v hlavě, že to přehlušilo všechny ty pěkné vzpomínky. Ve oknech kufry, krabice různý, před barákama šicí stroje, kola prostě, jo, okna do kořán pochopitelně a teď dobytek tam pobíhal.
Projeli jsme Buštěhradem, když jsme přijížděli na Kladno, tak tam
That last woman mentioning that, you know, all the happy memories that she had there, that final view that she had of it in ruin and during this destruction is the one that wins out. And I think that's particularly poignant. But here, and we'll hear about some of the kids, what happened to the ones that
Víte, já jsem měl to štěstí ještě s 2 děvčatama. To byla Dáša Veselá, které bylo asi kolem 7 let. Pak jsem byl já a Hana Špotová. Ty byly 2 roky, to byla z nás nejmladší. A my jsme jim padli do oka hned první den, když jsme přišli, když nás odvezli do toho renálního gymnázia, kde jsme byli v té tělocvičně na Slámě.
Tam vybrali těch 8 dětí a Hanfovic to byly 3 děti, že jo, Venda Hanf mezi náma nebyl, tak děvčata brečeli Anička, Maruška, že musí se starat o Venouška, no tak Venouška nám přidali.
A tam odsud z toho tábora nás odvezli zase do jiného tábora a o tam těch dětech, co tam zůstali, jsme vůbec nevěděli, co se s nima stalo. To jsme se dozvěděli až po válce, že byli v tom Chelmu zaplinovaný.
Narodil jsem se 24. dubna 1940.
I'll just give you one more to let them tell you what it was like returning after all of this. Well, first they'll talk about being Germanized.
To bylo v letě 43. Paní Hepfnerová, to byla vedoucí dětského domova. My jsme se jako procházeli, tam jsme dělali něco v tom parku a ona si mě zavolala, tak jsem přišla do kanceláře, no a tam byli jako manželé, řekla bych už starší. No a teď si mě začali prohlížet. Paní Hepfnerová potom mi sdělila, že jsou to manželé a že by si mě chtěli adoptovat. Já jsem ztratila své jméno a dali mi jméno Ingeborg.
Jmenoval jsem se Rolf Wagner. Já jsem se tam dostal 13. února 45. A v noci vypuknul ten největší nálet na Drážďany. To znamená ze 13. na 14. února 45.
Rusové tam to obsazovali, tak my jsme před tou frontou jako utíkali. Zabilo, to si pamatuju, zabilo se prase, naložilo do sudu, žebřiňák, že peřiny, protože to bylo v lednu. A 3 dny jsme takhle, vždycky na noc jsme někde spali a 3. den nás jako ty Rusové dohnali. Tak tam jsme zůstali, to bylo ještě v Polsku, až do konce války v tom květnu, nebo kdy to přesně bylo tam. No a tam nás zase vyhnali Poláci, že jo, protože jsme byli Němci. A jenomže mě už to nic neříkalo, že jsem z Československa, že jo, to. Věděla jsem, že to nejsou moje rodiče, ale kdybych bývala řekla, že jsem z Lidět, že on, tak jsem byla doma 1, 2, jenomže to už mě jako nic neříkalo.
Já jsem se vrátila ve 46. rok po válce, takže když jsem se vrátila, jsem neuměla ani slovo české. No, to většinou neuměli.
A teď, když jsme šli po Kladně a něco jsem chtěla, tenkrát byla zmrzná ještě v takových těch papírových bábovičkách, že jo. Tak se to válilo po ulici, tak jsem mi vždycky ukazovala nohou, že na tu bábovičku, jak věděla, že chci zmrzlinu a tak, no, pak jsem se naučila, šla jsem brzo do školy. 22. září jsem se vrátila a 8. října jsem šla do školy, no a tam to už se v tu dobu učili rusky, že jo. Já jsem mluvila německy, teď do toho česky, teď oni už zase rusky, tak no, pak jsem se naučila.
My jsme se s maminkou teda okamžitě pozdali, ale nemohli jsme se domluvit. Jo, maminka teda neuměla německy, nerozuměla, já zase neuměla česky, takže Hela Leflerovic mi dělala tlumočníka. Maminka ležela s otevřenou tuberkulózou v Praze v Krči a Já jsem se vrátila 7. srpna 46, to byly tatínkový narozeniny akorát, no a maminka 9. prosince zemřela.
A nejhorší.
So again, an interesting thing to see too, not just the moment of his tragedy, but also like what happens to these were the very few, the majority of the children of Lidice were gassed in Chełmno. The few that did survive had this unique and difficult experience of being taken from, their parents. A few of them were reunited, but forgetting the memories that they had in some cases. If they were very young, they didn't remember their parents at all. This woman the last one recognized her mom, but of course they couldn't communicate. So I think it's always important to think about sort of the long-term impact that this has on individuals. One of the memorials that we saw while in Lidice was this memorial to children victims of war. And this, we'll talk about this a bit more in our final session on memorialization. But this was a sculpture that was started in the 1960s, was not completed until the 1990s. And actually the original artist who did all the sculpting died before the final bronze statue could be cast. But you can see it includes some 80 children. They're looking off into the valley where the village once was. And as you can also see, people today bring stuffed animals and other childlike things to leave there at the memorial. There was post-war commemoration. The women who did survive came back. Some of the kids were able to come back. You can see in 1955, this is the gathering you see on the bottom. They do dedicate a garden of peace and friendship that you can see the modern picture that I took there today with rose bushes from around the world. And then of course they will found the new village of Lidice is in between where the old one was and this, well, this memorial is in between the old village and the new. In the midst of Lidice being destroyed, there are other Czech citizens who are taken to this shooting range outside of Prague, and shootings continue from May until July. Finally, there is a break in the case when one of the men involved in the assassination plot goes to the Gestapo. They put out a reward for information, and even though he was involved, you might think, oh, well, he gave himself up and they're going to kill him too. No, they actually didn't. But he gives up information about people who know where the parachuters are being held. So those individuals are the names that he gives. They're taken to this Gestapo headquarters, which is the MCHE Palace, which was actually a bank. It was built in the 1920s. The family who owned it, the MCHE family, they also had a large villa as well, but they sold all of their property and were able to leave before the Nazi occupation. So they did not get caught up by the Nazis. They were a Jewish family. And you can see here our group is entering this building, which today is part of the Czech Ministry of Trade and Industry. So it's kind of interesting. It is a government building, still very much a working government building. As of the 1948, it started and then continues now, though it is a national cultural monument. But what they've done is in the basement, they have preserved, not reconstructed, they've preserved what was the sort of interrogation and torture rooms and holding cells of the Gestapo. So this is where you can see our group is sitting. In the same place that these men are. People were taken there. They would be held in this room awaiting their interrogation. It's right next to where the interrogation and torture took place. So while they're sitting there, they could hear the brutality that was happening just down the hallway in this room. And here are some of the implements that they used. And some of the cells where people were held. What's interesting about this space, and we'll talk about this again in our final session on memorialization, when we look at other locations like the House of Terror in Budapest, there are other locations around Europe that have taken former Gestapo headquarters and made them into a museum, but very often those spaces are reconstructions. This space is original and authentic. The floor there is the same 1940s laminate floor that it was at the time. So there is a real authenticity to this space. This isn't a space that's normally open to tourists. So this is something that our group got that was very special. As it is in the basement of a government building, it isn't, again, easily accessible. There is a small museum there as well, but this is not something that museum professionals have done. People have typed up captions on typewriters and put things up with tape. And at one point there was just print offs from, the internet from like the early 2000s that were up in spots. So this is very, I don't want to use the word makeshift, but it certainly isn't done in a professional museum way because it's not really there for visitors. This is something that a space that opens for commemoration purposes. So occasionally has groups visit, but it is by no means something that is typically visited. So again, what we got to see there was very special and certainly not something that most people have access to. As a result of the interrogations and torture that happened, the people that were interrogated do give up the location of the parachuters. They are hiding in the crypt of the Cyril and Matthias Church. You can see the outside of it here in the middle. That's an opening that they eventually try and flood to flood the parachuters out of the crypt. This is the crypt where they were hiding. There's a gun battle that goes on between the Germans and these parachutists. And eventually, after more than 4 hours of fighting, some of them are killed during the firefight and others decide to, they're trying to tunnel out. When there's no way out, they decide to take their own lives rather than be taken by the Nazis. And so today, what we see is a memorial to each of them here in this crypt space where they died. And then again, on the outside, you can see a plaque commemorating that resistance and then the year 1942 when it took place on the ground. Following their deaths, another village which had more solid evidence, there was a radio transmitter that was found near this village. So a subsequent village is also destroyed and never rebuilt. So if we look at the overall price that was paid for the assassination of Heydrich, there's almost 15,000 people that were impacted, either killed, sent to camps, arrested, detained. So it really, it really was a massive reprisal. And it's the only time that a government was able to orchestrate the assassination of a top-level Nazi during the war. You can see again there. The man who turned them in, he did get his reward. He got a new identity and he married a German woman and continued on as a German collaborator for the rest of the war. After the war, he was tried and executed as, for treason, though he did say that he said, I think you would have done the same thing for 1,000,000 marks. Some people would, some people wouldn't. Obviously, many people gave their lives and died for the cause as well. Just a few, shots here on Prague after, as the war continues. As we know, Prague was largely undamaged. Certainly it didn't suffer no damage. It is damaged both by Allied bombs and then some fighting at the very end. But in terms of the large scale damage that European cities suffered, it was spared a lot of that. This is a famous building that most of you better know in this form, the dancing building there. See it? And then finally at the very end, we have, and literally the very end of the war, we have the Prague Uprising. So as we know, the war is going to end on May 8th, but in the final days of the war, the Czech radio begins broadcasting in Czech, which had been forbidden, and then it urges people to paint over the German signs in town and go back to Czech. And so you can see that's what people are doing, and also to begin building barricades. And so overnight, more than 2,000 barricades are constructed to keep the larger advancing German army out. You can see here's a map of Bohemian Moravia there, where the various armies are located. The Prague people are hoping that the US military is going to come into Prague and liberate it. Patton is advocating for this. Eisenhower does not endorse that, and so ultimately that isn't what happens. So Eisenhower agrees to let the Soviets take Prague, but they won't arrive until May 9th. So during these days, there is a lot of fighting that will continue to happen in Prague. The Czech civilians are aided by the Russian Liberation Army, which is a group of Soviet POWs that had been captured by the Germans, and then they agreed to fight for the Germans. So for the majority of the war, this particular group is fighting for the Germans. At the very end, they turn on the Germans and help the Czech people tremendously during this uprising. You can see some of the barricades there. So on May 7th, there's continued fighting. The Germans continue to fight the Czech people. The buildings are damaged. Various massacres happen of civilians throughout the city. They're used as human shields. Also on May 7th, so while fighting is still very much active in Prague, this is when the surrender is taken in the West. But there's a 48-hour grace period of when fighting will officially cease. And of course, a lot of Germans are using that to get to the West. So fighting continues in Prague. Again, more civilians die. Most of this Russian Liberation Army actually flees the city because they want to surrender to the Americans. So they've left. And finally, on May 8th, we start to see the Czechs do start negotiations with the Wehrmacht commander because he wants to get his troops out so they can also surrender to the Americans. And finally, that is what they agree to do. And as the last of the German forces leave, then here come the Soviet forces. Only 10 of this Ukrainian division actually die in the taking of Prague because most of the fighting was done. So they don't have to go house by house. You can see it really goes very quickly. They reach the outskirts at 4 a.m. and by 8 a.m. they're in the center of town. So a really fast victory for them. And then also on May 9th, that's officially when the Soviets will take the surrender in Berlin, and the war is now officially over. So this Prague uprising really does happen in the very, very last gasp of the war. In the aftermath, there were war crimes committed by both sides. Like the Czechs were killing Czech citizens who were of German ethnicity, and obviously the Germans were killing Czech citizens as well. And the Czechs will see this as yet again. The failure of the Western Allies to liberate Prague is very reminiscent of the Munich Agreement and when they were kind of abandoned by the West. So this will further push them towards the Soviets. And that the Russian Liberation Army that had been so helpful during the uprising, they will be turned over to the Soviets and tried as traitors. In the aftermath, we will see some of these ethnic Germans and German soldiers, rightly, interned. Some of them are interned in Theresienstadt. And eventually, a lot of these ethnic Germans who had never lived in Germany, some 3 million of them will be expelled and sent into Germany. Let's see that scene today. And then while they're awaiting transport, many of them are held at Theresienstadt, which we talked about last time. And it isn't until 1948 that the Soviets will close that. And finally, we started with this idea of thinking about what occupation means. And I think when we look at World War II, we have to think about how much of a civilian experience this was. Obviously, we often talk about that in terms of the Holocaust, and that is such an important piece of the civilian death. But 19 million civilians were killed in this event. And again, a good reminder to think about no other conflict in recorded history has killed so many people in such a short amount of time. All right, with that, I will stop my share and would like to invite Jessica Rockhold back on and Kathy Blake, who was one of our travelers on the European experience, to ask about their highlights and things that stood out to them. So Kathy, you have done a lot of travel. I think I'd like to start just by asking you what made this experience with MCHE unique. How did traveling with us enhance your experience?
I think it was enhanced because of all the educational component involved. We met for several months previous to the trip as a group, and then virtually with those people online who couldn't attend in person. So I felt like I knew most of the people in the group fairly well, as opposed to other trips where you get on a bus with 20 people that you really haven't met before. So that gave it an added bonus. I felt that it was so well organized, and particularly every day was packed with important places to see and do. I felt we made such good use of our time. The guides were exceptional. And you mentioned the Gestapo interrogation rooms. To me, that was a place that, as you said, most tours would not think about accessing or be able to access. And for me, that was a really important part of the trip to Prague.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. Certainly for me, that was one of the most impactful parts of that visit. Was there any other particular memorable moments that stood out to you while we were in the city or in Lidice?
Well, I know that you're going to talk about memorialization later, but Lidice was such, the entire place seemed to me to be kind of a pastoral memorialization. The statues were so interesting to see, just the quiet and peace of the place, and learning the history of the event of the assassination and the after effects as we actually toured the places, to learn about them and then be standing in those places was such an impactful way to learn about the history.
Thank you. Yeah, there's nothing quite like being in that space, right? Nothing takes the place of that. Jessica, what were some of your memorable experiences there?
I think I want to highlight this day in our tour as a package, because it's something that you and I talked about as we were planning it, because it wasn't direct Holocaust history, but we decided that it was so valuable for our learners to conceptualize the Holocaust within occupation. And sometimes, even though we understand that intellectually, we lose it as we're kind of engaging with survivor testimony or Holocaust history. We lose some of that broad context. And I feel like this day came together in a holistic way, because for those of you that join us next week, this is basically a community that we followed kind of start to finish through Europe. We talked about the Jewish experience of the Holocaust in Prague. We talked about terrorism. We talked about civilian occupation, and then we take it to Auschwitz. So it's this complete through line on this one event and this one community that came together. For me, I felt like standing in the Gestapo prison was deeply impactful. I am a museum person. I am museum trained. And so standing in a space that was meant to be like a museum, but was so authentic, was something unusual. There is something curated about a museum experience, just by definition. They're created by curators, but this was different and unique and so of the moment. The other place that really resonated with me was standing in the crypt, because it is a place where, because it is subterranean and it is cold and it is dark, you can, to a degree, imagine the moment for the people that were there. There is something visceral about feeling the space that was really resonant for me.
And I think in terms of feeling the space, very often when we are in Holocaust spaces, sometimes the walls are missing, right? Like a lot of camps no longer have that physical space. And so it is so often when we go to these places, we can't conceptualize it in the same way, because the geography of it is so changed. And I think that's something that really stood out in both of these particular historical locations, because it really is that same it looked and was the same. Yeah.
One of our participants, one of our travelers, is a professor from a university in Salina, Kansas Wesleyan University. And I know that this part of the trip was something that deeply resonated with him, and that he immediately went back and taught even that year. And I know you visited with him about that, Shelley. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, this is something that he planned this course. Once he knew this trip was happening and he signed up, he planned the course that he was going to teach in the fall semester to coincide with that. So he was planning to use the material and set his students up to be able to use what he brought back from the very beginning. So it was built into that course. And he did some really interesting things with especially the Lidice portion, and had, so he focused on, for this class, he did Lidice, he did Dachau, and he also did Auschwitz. And he had, he used his photographs to sort of like take the students through and had them listen to testimony, much like I had you do. And then he had them kind of write a reaction about, the things that stood out to them. And for them, not surprisingly, it was the children, and hearing about the stories of loss of the kids of Lidice. And for him personally, it was not only being in Lidice, but just as you mentioned, Jessica, being in the crypt and thinking about the events that happened there. So it was really interesting to speak with him to see how this was not just impactful to him personally, but he took it back to his students to use, really, like you said, just days after we returned, and something he'll continue to use in future semesters as well. So it was a really interesting discussion. All right. Do we have time to look at some of the questions?
We don't really have a question. There are some comments, but
Okay.
But not so many questions. I would encourage anybody that's still with us or with us today to join us the next 2 weeks. Next week, we're going to be talking about Krakow, Plaszow, and Auschwitz. And again, we'll bring this Czech story to its conclusion at Auschwitz. And the last week, we're dealing with memorialization, which will essentially bring us back to each place that we've already discussed, but also to Pilsen and Budapest and Zvolen, Slovakia, and a few places that we were in for shorter periods of time. So really encourage you to join us. And thank you so much, Kathy, for coming and sharing your experience with us.
Have a good day.
Good day, everyone.